faith in you and our hope in you and the joy that we have in Christ. And so we thank you that one of our brothers can join us tonight all the way from Australia to share what you're doing, the kind of work that you're doing in your church, and what's going on politically in that country. We thank you for his time, and we pray that you will bless him and Dr. Esri tonight with incredible wisdom, the ability to share their ideas with us, and that you'll give us open and receptive hearts so that we can learn and grow and ultimately become more like you. We thank you and we bless you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Folks, we are blessed to have Dr. Rick Sarre with us tonight. My wife and I have known Rick for over 20 years. We came out of China as teacher missionaries at a major university in China. And as the story goes, I met a man on a train. And one thing led to another, and this man hired me sight unseen to be a faculty member at the University of South Australia Law School. And you've regretted it ever since, is that right?
It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. Check's in the mail. At any rate, Rick has visited us in almost every place we've lived. And so it's been a privilege to have him come to Lithuania and all over the United States and
Adelaide.
Adelaide as well. So he is the dean at the University of South Australia School of Law. He was the dean when I was there, and now you're echoing back, the dean again. Mm-hmm. And I have been privileged to be associated and affiliated with the University of South Australia. My wife over here, Teresa Usry, wave your hand, hun. She loves Adelaide. She says Adelaide may not be exactly paradise, but it's right around the corner. So we have an opportunity to dialogue with Rick informally about life in Australia, particularly about issues that are geopolitical issues, immigration, gun control, geopolitics, many different issues tonight. And so as you listen, think of questions that you'd like to ask, because nothing's off base. Is that right, Rick?
That's right.
So he and I'll dialogue for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions, and we'll see wherever that goes. So let me introduce, this is Dr. Rick Sarre. Rick is an attorney, a well-respected criminologist and criminal attorney who's published extensively throughout Australia and many places in the world. He even travels more than my wife and I, which is amazing. He has lived not only in Australia, he finished his last year of college in a capstone year at a small Christian college in Iowa. Having grown up in Adelaide, somehow you made it to Iowa, and that was a great experience for you.
Can I tell about the first day I arrived? I was about your age, and I went to sign in and get my student card, and the young woman said, "Oh, I love your accent. Keep talking." So I never lost my Australian accent.
He has lived in many different places, including 4 or 5 years in Hong Kong and Vietnam, where you worked for an Australian Commission on Refugees. Mm-hmm. You represented refugees throughout the world. He is a blogger and an author, and
lived in Sweden.
Lived in Sweden,
yeah.
and an academic as well. So probably you'd identify yourself as a criminologist first and foremost.
Yeah.
But he is an expert in geopolitics in connection with Australia and many parts of the world, very knowledgeable about the United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Sarre.
Can I say I feel very welcome, and the Pledge of Allegiance brought me back many years. For the 2 summers that I was living in the States at your age, I worked in summer camps in a place called Lake of the Ozarks in central Missouri. And we used to do the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And it didn't matter what student it was, they would turn around and they'd do the Pledge of Allegiance, and they'd get to that line, "One nation under God, indivisible." And they'd all say, "invisible," and then chuckle. I thought that was pretty funny. One nation under God, invisible. Yeah. Anyway, I thought I'd share that. No one says that here, of course, do they?
No,
No.
not at all.
No.
Rick was moved today by the chapel service, particularly the worship component, as well as what happened and transpired there, because that's unusual in Australia, wouldn't you say?
It would never happen in Australia in a tertiary education setting. We have about 40 universities in Australia. Only 3 of them are private. That being the case, no public university would have such a gathering of students. The 3 private universities, both of the 2 religiously focused ones are Catholic, Australian Catholic University and Notre Dame University, which is affiliated with the Illinois or Indiana. Wherever Notre Dame is. But they would never have anything like that at all. They would not have anything that would bring the body together in a worship experience. That's quite unusual. And indeed, the college that I went to back in the 70s would not have had such a gathering either, even though we did have some very good worships. They were always on Sunday morning, not midweek.
You're here primarily because of a church conference that you'll be having next week, is that correct?
Yes. On Friday night in Independence, Missouri, which is a city which is affiliated with Kansas City. Anyone been to Kansas City? Put your hands up. Put your hands up, or leave them up if you've been to the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence. Yeah, okay, so you know what I'm talking about. It's a wonderful feature of this country that, for the most part, I wouldn't say every president, but I'd imagine that most presidents have got a library associated with their hometown, and the Independence Harry Truman Library, Presidential Library, is fabulous.
Let's jump right into it and talk about religious freedom in Australia. Religious freedom, particularly under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, has 2 components. One of which we're particularly focused on is the Free Exercise Clause, and that's been under attack in many respects. But can you tell us a little bit about freedom of religion in Australia, particularly, maybe we start at the very beginning, the Constitution of Australia, which really comes from the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, an act of Parliament of the
British Parliament.
British Parliament of the United Kingdom. But can you walk us through a little bit about religious freedom and the issues that are currently being faced in Australia at the federal level?
A little bit of background. Australia, as you probably all know, was settled by the British after the initial first fleet arrived in the late 18th century, in the 1780s. And then over the following 120 or so years, those states finally got together and decided they wanted to have a federated nation under one flag, a British flag at the time. So in 1901, Australia formed as its own separate nation. And to do so, the Brits had to pass an Act of Parliament in Britain, establishing Australia as a nation and establishing an Australian constitution, which was informed by the discussions through the 1890s in Australia. And in that constitution, section 116 guarantees freedom of religion. It guarantees freedom from any sort of persecution on the basis of your religious beliefs. So you couldn't be persecuted by being Muslim or Jew or Christian or anything like that. And secondly, it said that you cannot be excluded from public office on the basis of that particular choice, and nor could any public office make it a prerequisite for office that you had to be of a certain faith, typically in those days, the Christian faith. Now, I can assure you, having taught constitutional law for many years and having watched student bodies talk about the Constitution, that until about 6 months ago, or about 12 months ago, I don't think anyone in Australia even knew that we had Section 116. It all arose about 2 years ago when the groundswell began in Australia to recognise same-sex marriage. It was on the back of the Ireland plebiscite, which changed the law in Ireland. It also was on the back of a number of states. Would there be half the states of the Union here which would now have same-sex marriage? And interestingly, marriage here in your country is a state-based law. In my country, it's a national law. So if there was going to be a change to the definition of marriage, which until that time had always involved a man and a woman, it would have to be at the national level and would have to involve changing the Marriage Act. Well, that wasn't going to happen until there was indeed some feeling amongst the politicians that that's what the country wanted. So we had a plebiscite. A plebiscite is simply a show of hands. a compulsory plebiscite, I should add also, Kyle. So everyone voted, and something like 64, 63% of Australians voted to say that they would be not unhappy, or they'd be quite happy to have same-sex marriage as part of our law.
This was the entire country.
This was the
voted.
entire country. So it went to the National Parliament in Canberra, which is our national capital, and the debate went on. At this stage, the Conservatives, who were in power and still in power, had to put this bill to the Parliament, and of course, by virtue of the overwhelming two-thirds majority who wanted to make the change, most of those politicians fell into line with that particular idea of having same-sex marriage. But there were a number of Conservatives in the Conservatives who said, yes, but won't this make it more difficult for faith-based organisations to escape anti-discrimination law? So we have 40 years of anti-discrimination law saying you cannot make discriminatory decisions on the basis of a person's gender, their pregnancy, their age, and also their sexuality. So a number of faith-based organisations, particularly churches and colleges, now these are the religiously based colleges, not universities, but religiously based colleges, of which there are many, saw this as the thin end of the wedge to kind of tell them what to do about their hiring practices. So there was some pushback saying, we don't want to have our faith-based organisation subject to the anti-discrimination laws, which had always been the case, that they had certain exemptions, but now they were going to be allowing, maybe in these churches, in their chapels, for example, same-sex marriage. So they pushed back against that. Ultimately, the Conservative Prime Minister said, trust me, we will have, not only will pass this legislation, but I promise you I'll set up a freedom of religion inquiry. So the legislation
of sorts, like
a commission. So essentially the legislation went through. We can now have same-sex marriage. You don't have to, of course. A person can opt out. No minister or celebrant is forced to, obviously. You don't have to do it, but those who wish to do it can. And then we had this freedom of religion inquiry, which reported, that reminds me to send Dr. Sweeting that link, reported last December saying that it would be good for faith-based organisations to be protected by another Act of Parliament, a Freedom of Religion Act. Now that is yet to be debated, but that's on the card at the moment, and that report is on the website.
And the idea is that that would be statutory protection for churches and faith-based institutions to get a better set of exemptions, or a bigger set of exemptions?
Better set up exemptions etched in stone, because at the moment those exceptions are not etched in stone. They have general exceptions within the anti-discrimination legislation. But for example, what about someone who's been hired who then enters a same-sex marriage and then wishes to have a class on the benefits of same-sex marriage? There's nothing in the legislation that allows that person's employment to be terminated. They don't have that level of exemption. Now, whether that should or should not be the case is a matter for debate, but we haven't had that debate. There's been some pushback from the Labor Party. I'm a member of the Labor Party, saying that those discrimination or anti-discrimination pieces of legislation are sound, don't touch them. So the debate is yet to happen. The complication is we have a national election next month, and it's likely that the Labor Party will come back in, so it's unlikely for that new legislation to pass.
But the point is that the design is to make it part of a statute legislation, as opposed to leave it to the courts in Australia.
Yes, that would be, and to make those exemptions far clearer in legislation than having broad-based exemptions in anti-discrimination which have not simply been clear enough.
Contrast that within the United States, where we will ask the Supreme Court to make a decision on that, finding the correct case and have it argued properly, and all the long processes of having the courts make that decision, as opposed to a blue ribbon commission saying, let's pass a statute to provide that.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about the political system in Australia. You don't do 2 years of campaigning for Parliament or Prime Minister, right?
We have 5 weeks. Wouldn't that be nice? 5 weeks. 5 weeks of campaigning. And we don't have fixed terms at the national level. So we're very much like the British system. The Brits Prime Minister makes the call. He or she waits for the approximate constitutional period, which is 3 years, and then has a window that you have to call the election within, let's say 3 years, is actually due in August this year, but the understanding is they're going to call the election in May, June, July, August. So 3 months on that window of opportunity. So they could call the election any time between, say, May and October. They've decided to go early for whatever reason. They look at the polls and they kind of suddenly say, right, now's the election. And I think this weekend, this coming weekend, we will know the date of the election. There's always a bit of frisson about that. You know, when's the election going to be called? What are the issues going to be? And I've run for office twice. People often say, did you win? And I say, of course not, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So no, I didn't win, which is a sore point, but that's another story for another day. But yes, we operate on the British system with two parties. The party that becomes the Prime Minister and leads the Parliament is the party that garners the most seats in our legislature. There's 150 seats in the legislature, and the party that basically wins 76 seats will govern, very much like the British system. We have a kind of a separation of powers, but we don't have a presidential system where executive is governed by the President and his team, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defence, etc. Our executive is essentially the Queen, but she just kind of rubber stamps everything the executive says. The executive essentially are all the ministers of the Crown in the Parliament. So that's the big thing. We have a big separation between the Parliament and the executive from the judiciary, but our executive and our Parliament are one and the same virtually.
About a year ago, my wife and I were in Adelaide, and we were at your opening campaign.
Yeah.
And
Kyle took the money.
Yes.
Yeah.
He said, let the American handle the money.
Yeah.
You know how to do that really well in America, so why don't you handle the donation side? But at any rate, you did a campaign, and we'd almost often call it maybe more retail politics. It was very much pressing the flesh, getting out, knocking on doors, speaking to people, building relationships, as opposed to maybe what we might see in terms of advertising on television and the like. Is that a fair statement, Rick?
That's a fair statement, although we are going down the path a lot more following the success of the Obama campaign, what's that, 10 years ago now, which was really the first campaign to engage social media. Mm-hmm. So we're now getting far more savvy about that. But let me leap from that subject to the next one you're going to come to, which is about compulsory voting. And one of the things about American politics, and I've been around American campaigns over my years. I taught at the same college back in the 90s with my family. I forget what the election was about or who was there at the time. It'll come to me. Who was the flip-flop man, so-called flip-flop man? Anyway, he was running for the Democrats at the time against one of the Bushes. But so I was here for that particular campaign. And what concerned me was the amount of donation money that was going to just simply get people to get out to vote, and how much time was spent on getting people out to vote. So we've solved that issue. We have compulsory voting. Everyone has to vote. Now someone says, wait a minute, but that's hardly democratic. Well, is it democratic to have your president, who essentially is the president on around about 46, 47% of the actual vote, somewhat guided by the electoral college system, which I've never really understood, and in fact ultimately was actually elected and voted by only 25% of Americans, eligible voters. So Donald Trump's in the White House with the support of about a quarter of this eligible population. That doesn't make sense to me. So we have compulsory voting. What does that mean? It means when you go to the poll, and we have massive polls, in other words, the number of polling booths in any one electorate. In my electorate, where there are 100,000 voters, there are 45 places you can vote over a 10-hour period, so there's no waiting, and it's on a Saturday when most people are typically not working. I understand it's here on a Tuesday, originally, to stop a lot of working people from having the opportunity to vote for their working class colleagues. Now that might be an unusual take on that, but it's not a Tuesday, it's a Saturday. And if you don't vote, or you don't have to vote, you just have to turn up and have your name checked off, just like you were coming in here tonight and checking off your name. If you don't vote, you get fined. The fine is $10. But if you didn't get there for whatever reason, you ring them up and say, oh, I was sick. Oh, okay. So it's hardly an onerous system. They don't put you in jail. So Most people think, oh, well, it's actually a lot of fun. Why is it a lot of fun? Because around the polling booths, and the polling booths are always at schools, kindergartens and churches, they love it because they have their trading table, they have their sausage sizzle, they have their lucky dip, face painting for the kids. They do most of their fundraising for that year on election day, and everyone knows everyone else. It's like a big party. And you vote and you go home. It's lovely. And everyone does it. And it's sort of kind of like a civic duty, which actually means that by the end of the day, the Prime Minister that we have has been elected by 99.9% of the eligible voting population. Once you're over a certain age, and I think it's probably if you're in your 80s, all you have to do is ring up and opt out. You don't have to vote if you're over 80, I think. But mind you, you can continue to vote until you opt out. Yeah.
Let's talk about the relationship with Great Britain, though, and that is Australia has a Governor General who is the Queen's representative, and the Governor General, which means the Queen can dissolve Australian Parliament.
Under the Constitution.
Under the Constitution. Americans would find that abhorrent.
I would have thought so.
But
so do I, but that's another story.
did that ever happen in Australia?
It has happened once. It happened in 1975. We had a kind of firebrand Prime Minister. His name was Gough Whitlam. He was coming out of the Conservative years of the 1970s under a Prime Minister Menzies and a Prime Minister Fraser. And in 1975, having had something like 30 years of Conservative rule, a Labor politician finally came along and said, I can lead this country. You would actually talk about multimedia. There was a television slogan, and all these lovely people sitting on the television singing this song about it's time for freedom, time for living, time for something. Yes, it's time. And it was kind of it's almost like it's sort of an Obama thing. It was time, now's the time to do this. In 1972, he was elected. In 1975, the powers that be conspired against him to convince the Governor-General to say that he was out of control in his spending, such that the Parliament was no longer passing legislation to enable the public service to be paid. Sounds like something that happened here quite recently. In those circumstances, the Governor-General took the advice of the Queen, well actually the Queen took the Governor-General's advice, to dissolve the Parliament, to send the Parliament to an election, and the Conservative government was restored. I rather like Gough Whitlam. That period was an interesting time for Australia. A number of things happened. Some of you may not know, but until that time, until 1972, there was conscription in Australia sending balloted 18-year-olds to Vietnam. I don't think there's one person in this room that would know that 300 and something Australians lost their lives in the American coalition in Vietnam. It's a very unknown fact in the United States. When I went to college in 1978, there wasn't one person in my college that knew that Australia was even in Vietnam. Now, 300 people dying as opposed to 50,000 Americans dying is a big difference. But we were there under Lyndon Baines Johnson all the way with LBJ. How did I get onto that subject? So Gough Whitlam stopped conscription. He brought in free university education. Free university education. So I did my entire 4 years of law school and did not pay a cent in tuition. Why did he do that? He did that because he figured that the only people at that time who were going to university were kind of elite people who could afford it, and it was time to free up the population. Now, having said that, and leaping ahead 5 conversations, about a decade later, that was massively relaxed. Why? Because the sociologists were telling us that it took more than money to get people to get to university. And in fact, what was happening is that all the children of the professionals were now getting free education, and the leakage into education of those people who'd never been to education or ever been to universities was going so slow it needed some other incentive rather than just removing the fees. So we now have a contribution scheme. My 2 kids have just both graduated from law school. They didn't pay anything except a kind of a holding fee, a student services fee of about $300 or $400 a year. That's US dollars. But they will now have a debt of around about $25,000 US dollars for a 4-year degree. People got their mouths open down there. It doesn't cost very much. It's a contribution scheme which doesn't have to be repaid until such time as their income through the taxation system reaches a certain level, at which point they'll be taxed. While I'm on that subject, speaking of the taxation, we also have and have had entrenched since the Whitlam years. This again was another Whitlam initiative, Medicare, which essentially is Obamacare. So we have had a free medical system that's for surgery, for anything you like, not unlike Canada and the United Kingdom. And all you do is you get taxed 1.5% of your taxation. So that's the way in which we fund our Medicare system.
Rick, isn't that mostly major medical, though? Is that correct? It's for major...
No, if I want to go and see an MD, a GP, I'll go along and I will pay the money, and it gets, well, it's not quite true. There's a contribution of about $10 or $15 in that. But if I go and pay $95 to go and see a doctor, I get an immediate refund, and that's part of the system.
But if you want to have a knee replacement, for example...
If you want to have a knee replacement through the public system, you'll wait. You can also go through the private system, in which case you would then pay a private contribution to your private provider, but that private provider contribution is tax deductible.
So that would be a private insurance.
Private insurance.
And many people do have private insurance.
I'd say about a quarter of the population.
Back to Australian politics. In 1999, there was, I guess you call it a plebiscite of sorts. Referendum.
Yeah.
About whether to adopt the American model of a presidency. And that failed.
It failed because our Constitution is not unlike the American Constitution, a revered document. People don't like to play with constitutions. We've had something like 44 attempts to amend our Constitution, and only 8 of those have succeeded. So it's a hard thing to get anything changed. In the Constitution, the Queen is the head of state, the head of the executive, and through her Governor-General, rubber stamps whatever comes out of the Parliament. This amendment was actually a modest amendment. It wasn't going to install a different type of executive. The executive would simply be, once again, a kind of a rubber stamp through a Governor-General type person, but that person was going to be appointed by the Parliament. It failed because they couldn't agree on the model of that particular person. Was it going to be a direct election like the American model, or was it going to be an appointment by the Parliament, which was a softer model? Eventually, the government, in a rather wily way, recognising how many people wanted the more American model, put the question, do you want to have a head of state elected by the Parliament itself? And all the monarchists who wanted to hang on to the Queen said, those politicians, you don't want politicians to make decisions for you, which was rather disingenuous, considering, in fact, that's what we elect people for. But to keep that to one side, and ultimately the referendum was defeated. So a Republican like myself, who actually wants to see the end of the Queen, has a battle, an uphill battle. Here we are some 20 years on, and there's no proposal, anything like that, ever since. And I'm facing the battle that once Prince Charles takes over from his mother, probably in the next few years, hangs on to that for a dozen years, then he passes it over to William and Kate, who've got these really cute kids. And that's going to be destroying us in the ballot box. I mean, who wouldn't want William and Kate and cute kids as part of that family of government?
Do you think there will ever be a referendum again for an American?
Oh yes, I think the referendum, part of the Labor policy, I should say, ahead of the forthcoming election, is to put in place that whole process to have another referendum. But that referendum will not go to the poll without bipartisan support. That's the problem with a referendum. If you don't go to the poll with the majority of people on both sides or clear sides of the Parliament, it's not going to pass.
You think it'll happen in your lifetime?
In my lifetime it will. I would say it would happen in the next dozen years. Yeah.
Let's talk about preference voting. This is a system that I found appalling at first when I heard about it. And let me see if I can describe it as an example. Let's say you have 10 people running for office. The sort of the first one across the finish line with a majority vote or with even a plurality vote is not necessarily the one that's elected under this system, the preference system. So if you go into the polls and there are 10 people running, you rank them. You say, this person is number 1 on my list. This person who I really like is number 10, who I really dislike is number 10 on the list. And you rank them throughout 1 through 10. And everybody does that, and the person that comes out with the highest point or lowest point.
As soon as someone gets across 50%.
So as soon as somebody gets across 50%, they win.
Yep.
But it could be an instance where, let me just think hypothetically, that Clinton supporters would rank Trump at the bottom of the list, 10, and Trump supporters rank Hillary at the bottom of the list, put their man at number 1, and you might end up with somebody who actually is second and third on most everybody else's list, or a woman who's second and third on everybody's list, but might be the least objectionable of the candidates. And that's who gets elected. Is that possible?
It's possible. There are 3 systems. The Brits run a system of first past the post. So you don't have to get to 50%. If you've got 10 people running and the front runner gets 33%, he or she wins. That's the end of the matter. That's like the horse race. They went across the line first. And in fact, on that subject, the Brits were trying to get to a preferential system. Well, someone put this to the Brits on a referendum a few years ago, and the anti-preference people put up an ad, and it had an advertisement, I should say, that's the way you say it, an advertisement that had a horse race, that had a horse crossing the line, but then the horse that came in third or fourth was actually deemed the winner. And they said, is that really fair? And that was the end of that. They didn't pass that legislation at all. The American model is a slight variation on that. So you've got 2 or 3 people who are polling around about 30 or 40%. You eliminate the others and then have a runoff between the front 2 runners. So you have 2 elections, and then the runoff, obviously you only got 2 people. One of them has got to get more than 50%, and he or she is declared the winner. The Australian model is best illustrated by a story that I was telling Kyle earlier today, which happened when I was in student politics in Iowa in the 1970s. My man was one of 4, and they were all men at the time, for Graceland student president. I thought, right, I'll support this particular character who was a friend of mine. The poll continued, all the students voted, and in the end the front runner got 40% of the vote. My man, the second runner got, for argument's sake, something like 23% of the vote. My man got 20% of the vote, and the last one got 10 or 15%. So they said, that's easy. We'll have a runoff between the 40%er and the 23%er.
Your third man being out.
My third man is now gone. He's out. And I said, is that really fair? What do we know about the preferences of the guy who was eliminated? There's 10 or 15% of the votes back there. Who would they have thought of about the other 3? And what if all of them, like my man, which would allow him to leapfrog over the 23%er? Let's take all those 15, add to 20, we've now got 35. Ooh, 35 beats 23. So why should the runoff be between those front 2 runners when 2 and 3 were so close and we don't know the preferences of the last one? So the GSG, the Graceland, that's the university I was at, GSG presidency, convinced the council to change to a preferential system. They adopted, after I left, they went back to the other system. I don't know why. But in any event, the preferential system was there historically for a couple of years. But it does allow a person to leapfrog over others by garnishing their preferences and then redistributing the preferences of those who are knocked out. The nice thing about that is you might have 6 people on your ballot. You actually think that number 2 and 3 are probably the most favoured ones, but you're really wanting an independent, let's say your neighbour, and you think, I'd like to give her a ballot here. I think more women should be elected. I don't think she's going to win, but I'd like to give her number 1. In your system, once you've given her number 1 and she's eliminated, you have no say over 2, 3 and 4. In our system, you can then say, well, she's not going to win, but I'd like her to get some votes. There's my number 1, and there's my 2 and 3. And the 2 and 3 eventually will, your vote will count for them eventually. In a non-preferential system, once your man or woman's eliminated, you have no say whatsoever. And that's why I like the preferential system. And indeed, one of the things when they're counting those votes, if a ballot doesn't have a number in every square, it's tossed away. You have to vote. So not only do you have to be there, tick your name off, once you do get a ballot, for your ballot to be valid, you have to number every square. So that's, and we don't have a write-in candidate. That doesn't happen in our system as well. You know, I've seen a few, Pooh Bear, Winnie the Pooh, Bernie Sanders in Australia. whatever that means. Yeah. But people have a lot of fun with ballot papers too.
Let's talk a little bit about gun control. We have a picture, a depiction of the country of Australia. The country of Australia has 6 different states, right?
A map. I'm excited.
And
6 states.
6 states and a territory.
Yep.
And one of the states is Tasmania, down below, about the size of the state of Ohio.
Everyone knows about the Tasmanian devil. Zzz. Do they still have that on television here? Yeah.
There is such a thing as a Tasmanian devil.
There is. It's a really quite fierce character. Little tiny little rodent-y thing, natural marsupial.
It's a marsupial equivalent of a wolverine.
Yes. Yes. It's got very sharp teeth. And I went to college and they said, Australian, do you spin around? Remember the Tasmanian devil spun around? And does the blood rush to your head? Don't try that with Australians. That was pretty funny, down under. Yeah. Okay.
Back before 1990.
Just before that, Kyle,
Yes.
I'm from Adelaide. So if you look at South Australia, you see where all those little red lines come together.
Yes.
Adelaide is the capital of South Australia. That's where I'm from. But you can see Tasmania down the bottom. Yes, sorry.
Back before 1990, there were a series of mass shootings in Melbourne. And these were quite bad. There was, tell us what happened in 1990, and then in Tasmania in 1996.
Now, I'm just trying to do some quick calculations here. I imagine most of you were being born about that time, the late 90s. Is that kind of the age group here? So the late 1980s, there had been 2 shootings in Melbourne, both of them involving disaffected workers. It's a sad indictment on our workplaces, not only in my country but yours, that people have such bad relationships, they've been sacked or whatever, that they then go in with a gun and start shooting people. That happened in Melbourne on 2 occasions within the space of a month or 2. So the Australian government set up a national inquiry, a national committee on violence. And at the time, I was a criminologist working at a university in South Australia, and I was part, not of the committee itself, but part of the think tank that brought together a whole bunch of people to make laws and make recommendations about making Australia a less violent place. The National Committee recommended a whole range of things about gun control and the limitation on semi-automatic and military-style weapons which had been used in these shootings. At the time, Australia was kind of a frontier land. Yes, there was a registration system, but it was loosely based around the states. Oh, here's Tasmania. Loosely based around the states. There wasn't a national approach. And even though these recommendations went to the various governments, no one was taking them seriously. And then on a fateful day in April, so we've just actually had, I'm just trying to think, we're coming up to the anniversary. Yes, it would be April the 9th or something, I think it was, of 1996. A man of some limited intelligence who had been upset about something took 2 or 3 semi-automatic rifles to an idyllic, gorgeous place in southern Tasmania called Port Arthur.
See if I get Port Arthur.
And Port Arthur is, in fact, you can see it, the bottom right-hand corner. If you've got very good eyes, you can see the word Port Arthur. In fact, I might get you to point to
there it is.
There it is there. Yes, Port Arthur there. Now, the reason that Port Arthur is even there, just look above Port Arthur, you can see a thing called Eagle Hawk Neck. And this is a natural piece of land where, to get to the peninsula on which Port Arthur is, there is an isthmus, if that's the word, a tiny piece of land which would be no wider than this room, and to get to that peninsula you had to cross through that area. So it was a wonderful place for the first settlers to bring prisoners. Now, some of you may know Australia was settled only because in 1788 we decided to bring all of Britain's extra prisoners to Australia to put them to work on the new colony, etc., as prison labour. That was the whole idea.
Instead of Georgia,
instead of bringing them here because the Americans had just had this wonderful war of revolution that had said go away, so the Britons couldn't continue to bring their prisoners here. So they sent them to Australia instead. And one of the first prisons was built at Port Arthur. Why? Because they could actually defend this piece of land. So anyone who escaped would either have to swim the shark-infested waters. I should add, remember the show Jaws? You know? Jaws? You like that? Jaws was filmed off South Australia. The actual filming of the sharks that made their way into the movie Jaws were all filmed off South Australia. So there's a lot of sharks down there. spiders, snakes. But it's a lovely place to visit. Please come and see us. But just Eagle Hawk Neck, you can actually put a chain across it with a bunch of barking dogs and a few persons with muskets, and essentially you could make sure that not one prisoner was ever going to escape. So Port Arthur was a prison camp. And now it's a tourist attraction, just like you'd go to any of your, Alcatraz or something like that and see what life was like back in the 1870s. And there were a whole bunch of tourists down there this day, and this person came in and tragically and in a bizarre fashion just took these loaded semi-automatics and killed 36 people in about 10 minutes. And of course, this was so horrendous that the government, a conservative government of a Prime Minister who went on to have a 10-year Prime Ministership, John Howard, had only been in office for 6 weeks, called a national summit of all the police ministers and brought about gun control, which we still have today, some 20, whatever it is, years on, 23 years on. Now, most of you probably have followed the news in the last month, where about 3 weeks ago we had this most horrendous similar shooting where some 50 people were shot in a mosque, in 2 mosques, in fact, in Christchurch, in southern New Zealand. And again, by a person loaded with a whole range of semi-automatic weapons, which were not so banned in New Zealand. In Australia, semi-automatic weapons were all confiscated, actually handed in with a huge compensation scheme.
They were bought back by the government. They were bought
back by the government. The government in American dollars spent about $250 million buying every last shotgun and semi-automatic, which were then destroyed. And any person who now wants one can't have one. You just simply can't have a semi-automatic, a rifle or pistol. And you can't have a pump-action shotgun. If you need a rifle or any other gun for whatever purpose, particularly farmers and hunters and those sorts of things, you have to be licensed. So every firearm is licensed and every user is licensed in Australia now. And as a result of this horrendous shooting in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, has announced, and in fact, I looked at my feed this morning, the Parliament sat for the first time to consider her initiatives in banning guns and setting in place a new registration and licensing system, and it passed 119 to 1 in the New Zealand Parliament this morning. The gun control initiatives, I'm quite happy to say, have been a success for the last 23 years. No more mass shootings. That's only one way in which you could possibly make some assessment about that. And if anyone's interested, I recently wrote an 800-word blog the day after Jacinda Ardern announced that, which you can read online, and Kyle will give you the connection to it, which talks about the last 23 years as a result of bringing those guns.
So an Aussie was the one that shot up the mosque.
Yes, I mean, that's the sad thing as well. The shooting up at the mosque was from a disaffected Queensland Australian white guy who just didn't like the idea of Islamization or his perception of that, of New Zealand.
But he bought weapons in New Zealand that he could not have bought in Australia.
He was perfectly licensed in New Zealand to have the weapons that he had, even though the weapons themselves were not registered because they didn't have to be.
These would be AR-15s.
I don't know if it was an AR-15, but certainly it was. I don't think it was an assault rifle, and a semi-automatic rifle with a large magazine.
Large magazines.
Yeah.
Let's talk about immigration a little bit. Australia, because it's bound by water, it has no land borders per se. It's the continent as well as a country that fulfills all of those borders. Let me see if I can get back to the...
There we are.
So it doesn't face the same challenges that we do with Mexico or Canada, but you've had your own challenges.
You don't want Canadians here. Gee whiz.
You've had your own challenges in connection with immigration, particularly during the Howard period of boats that were bringing in people that were trying to claim asylum and the like, and then some very difficult decisions were made about that by John Howard.
Yeah. Let's go back about 40 years, the end of the Vietnam War, as a result of which, same thing this country as well, tens of thousands of South Vietnamese left that country. They could no longer live in a country that was about to be dominated by the North Vietnamese communists because obviously they fought on the wrong side. But of course Australia felt some degree of obligation, as the Americans did and other coalition partners did, to take the people who now needed to leave Vietnam. So we had a huge wave of Vietnamese immigrants who have now made their home. And in fact, I'll just say last Sunday morning, I went to the local temple because the person who runs the temple was my interpreter in Hong Kong. That's a long story. And in fact, he wanted me to talk to these junior teens about going to law school. That was the reason I was there. So there's actually a very vibrant Vietnamese community in Adelaide. So we've had a history of more recent Asiatic migrants. After the Second World War, massive, as I'm sure you did here as well, massive migrants from Southern Europe, particularly the Italians, the Greeks, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, etc., came from Eastern Europe to Australia, essentially to start afresh. And that wave of migration has continued. But still, the main number of people coming to Australia in migration programs or assisted programs are British. Having said that, and I said to Kyle, some 10% of Australia's population now is either Asian-born or their parents were Asian-born. So we're becoming very much an Asian country, which I think is a wonderful part.
Didn't one of your prime ministers call Australia an Asian country?
Paul Keating was the first person to say, isn't it marvellous that we're now an Asian country? I think it was a bit premature, but we're moving that way. And I think we like to see ourselves as being not only an enclave of Western values in the South Pacific, but also we have very strong ties. China is our main trading partner. Japan is number 2 and Indonesia is number 3. So it gives you some idea about where our trading and where our partnerships have to be. But
immigration.
Immigration. So we take something like 300,000 people into a population of 25 million every year. That's quite a sizable amount. Of that 300,000, about 60,000 are people who qualified as refugees under the refugee program. That doesn't stop. Well, that actually is only people who are in a position to apply for refugee status through one of the normal channels, wherever they are. But throughout the 1990s and into 2000, we had a lot of people who were leaving those very, very troubled areas, and they're still troubled. That whole Middle East in Iraq, Iran, Syria, those countries and northern African countries making their way to Indonesia in order to come to Australia to apply for asylum. Why didn't they apply for asylum in Indonesia, which after all was their first stop? Because Indonesia is not a signatory to the Convention on Refugees. Because otherwise they have to, under the law, apply for asylum in the first country they come to, which is a signatory. Now, I don't know why Indonesia is not a signatory, probably because they rather like the idea they can actually shift people on. And we had hundreds, something like 30,000 people in the space of 10 years tried to make their way, just off the map there, where you can see sea at the top. It's not very far away to get to Indonesia. And people get onto leaky boats, as they do across the Mediterranean all the time, as they were trying to get, as you know, into Greece from Turkey in the last dozen years. And what happens to half of those leaky boats? They go to the bottom of the ocean. And it was a dreadful carnage of people who were dying. And the government said, well, we don't want those deaths to occur. Let's stop our boat migration. I do think behind there somewhere there was a little bit of racism and xenophobia. I'd hate to think that was the case, but I've got a feeling a lot of people who said, oh, we want to stop the boats so that people don't die at sea, but we actually don't want too many more people coming from those Muslim nations. Don't think the Australian people are as well-giving and hospitable as maybe sometimes made out. In any event, the boats did stop. Why did they stop? Because the Australian government then said and advertised that any person in a boat picked up by a rescue ship or who got to the shore would never, ever finally settle in Australia. As a result of that message getting through, the whole people smuggling business stopped. We haven't had one boat arrival in the last 5 years, and there's now bipartisan support for that approach. It is assuaged by the fact that we now do get to this 60,000 people coming in on assisted refugee practices a year. But it's been 20 years of political turmoil, particularly given that there are still people on Manus Island, which is an island which is actually part of Papua New Guinea, which was a long time a protectorate of Australia, who were sitting there twiddling their thumbs with refugee status, who can't come to Australia but have got nowhere to go. And we're still not quite sure what to do. The New Zealanders, Jacinda Ardern, said, we'll take them, but Australia didn't want that to happen unless it started the boat traffic again. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but it's a sore point, and will come up again in this election.
When I first lived in Australia in 1988, it was very much, I'm going to call it, the way I saw it, sort of white privilege society. As a result of sort of this immigration and the influx of many people from Asia, China, Southeast Asia, it's changed the culture, hasn't it, Rick? It's changed it maybe in terms of work ethic, in terms of broader geopolitical view, it's benefited Australia, wouldn't you say, for the large part?
It has, and as I said, that flavour is such that I think at my local elementary school, something like 50 languages are being spoken. And in fact, Chinese language, Mandarin, is now compulsory for the first 3 years. You don't force a kid into learning Chinese. It's a tough language to learn. But they might want to make that opportunity available to them. So we're trying to very much Asianise our curriculum so that we do feel like we're part of Asia. But the multicultural society, I think, is one of the great success stories of Australia for the last 50 years.
Sydney in particular.
Sydney in particular is the second most multicultural in terms of languages spoken at home, divided by the number of people in the language, percentage-wise, in a large city. London is the most multicultural city in the world. Sydney is 2, and New York's probably up close as well.
Let's talk a little bit about economics. I see Professor Durr in the back. And Australia was called a lucky little country for a while because it did not have a downturn economically for over 30 years. I'm not sure it was so much luck. You had some great treasurers, Fed chairman, if you will, who helped manage the money supply, but it recognized that it needed to do these deals with China and Southeast Asia. That's where they were going to be able to establish trade and investment. Is that correct?
Australia has not had a recession. Paul Keating famously said in 1994 it was the recession we had to have. So that's been 25 years since our last recession. During the global financial crisis a decade ago, Australia did not, I think was the only OECD country not to go into recession as a result of that. And that was because the government put on a fiscal stimulus package to give money to schools, universities, educational institutions, healthcare, roads, etc. So in other words, they spent their way out. This was the Labor Party. A lot of people say it was a legacy that we've now been left in terms of deficits, although in the next election, coming up in 5 weeks' time, we'll have the first surplus, I think, in the last 25 years since that time. So we're back to surplus. It took us 25 years. But we haven't had a recession. Australia has been going very strongly economically, although we are at the whim of the rest of the world. I mean, we've only got 25 million people. It makes it very vulnerable, as we've often said. If the US sneezes, we catch a cold. The downturn, or I won't say the downturn, but certainly the slowing down of the Chinese economy has affected us, but the Chinese buy all of our minerals and our ores, our coal, our iron ore, our silver, our bauxite, those sorts of things. And that's been our major export. Education, I should say, in terms of dollar value to Australia, is our second most valuable industry, the education industry. We probably have 200,000 or 300,000 students, international students, coming to Australia at the moment every year. So it's a massive industry.
We noted that in Adelaide that...
Have we lost you? We've lost you.
I'll speak louder. In Adelaide in particular, my class in the law school had about 50% of those students were internationals, all the way from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, Africa, even a place called the United States. That was a fun thing for me to participate in, but that's not unusual, particularly in connection with Adelaide.
Adelaide likes to see itself as an education city, particularly for Chinese students and particularly for Indian students. It's a very easy city to get around. It's a very safe city, and economically it's strong, and they are welcomed by 3 very big universities.
Often,
Use this one.
Excuse me, but we noticed that a number of Chinese would come in and their parents would come in with them and buy an apartment or a home for them to live while they were into school. And then eventually those Chinese would stay and the parents would move permanently to Australia. Is that right?
Why wouldn't you? No, seriously. Has anyone been to Beijing and taken a big deep breath? The consequence of that Asianisation and industrialisation of China has been massive amounts of pollution in the air. And I've been to Beijing and been in a high-rise hotel and could hardly see the building maybe 50 metres away for the smog in the air. Now, it clears every now and again. It cleared during the Olympics. Why? Because in the 3 or 4 weeks prior to that time, the government, which governments can do, authoritarian governments can do, was to shut down all their local industries that were spewing things into the air. So during the Olympics, beautiful blue skies. And as soon as the Olympics was finished, the factories cranked up again the way they went. So yes, I mean, I've been to China a number of times. Kyle and Teresa have lived in China. Some of you have probably been to China or visited or have studied there. It's a tough country to live in. I think in terms of lifestyle, weather, politics, economics, culture, Australia is a wonderful place to be. Am I convincing you to come and do an exchange out there?
One other question.
Has anyone been to Australia, by the way? I should put a hand up, a hand or two. On an exchange or just holiday? Yeah. Where were you? Sydney, Perth. Look, right in the middle there. Adelaide. No one's been to Adelaide. Come next time. Sorry, Kyle.
Just one last question, and then we'll open up to the audience. Gosh, and I've lost my train of thought.
We were talking about China, we were talking about pollution, we were talking about people buying houses and economic stimulus.
It'll come to me.
It'll come to you.
Question.
Let's take a question.
So we have people in the back that will bring a mic to you. You want to take this as well?
Let's go to Sydney first here.
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Especially, I actually just got back from Sydney in December. And I completely saw what you were saying with the multicultural and largely Asianized culture. That was very obvious from my observation. But also, I think that one thing I noticed, and I was not fully immersed in a foreign policy environment, but it did seem like something I picked up about foreign policy from Australia is that they tend to be able to turn a blind eye to aspects of development or aid or really any kind of interventionist policies overseas. And I'd like to hear what you think about that. But more specifically, my question is actually, there are a couple aspects of Australian policy that I think Americans look at fearfully. The gun policy and especially something like the high minimum wage, and they see those as socialized policies. However, the outcomes that you're talking about with the reduced gun violence and the lack of a economic downturn seem like those have actually been successful. And so I'm just wondering, what is it about those policies that have prevented many of the fearful outcomes that we project in America?
Okay, there are three questions there. One's about gun policy, which I won't come back to. There might be a more specific question a bit later. One's the so-called living wage, and I'll tell you a little anecdote about that in a minute. And one is about foreign policy, particularly the relationship with China. As you know, there's been a great deal of activity from the Chinese militarization, the militarization of the South China Sea. If we've got our map still, coming into the Coral Sea and that whole area, and China spending a lot of money in a number of the nations, Vanuatu, Samoa, the other islands, the Cook Islands, etc. A lot of infrastructure of China in that South Pacific region. And a lot of people are now putting a lot of pressure on Australia to say, well, where is your hand? Are you going to be with the Americans in relation to being very fearful about the China militarization? Or are you going to stick with the Chinese as if there's kind of a one or the other? Australia at the moment is playing two hands. Although there's an anecdote about that. Just recently, China got upset with the fact that we were still having direct flights to Taiwan, or Qantas was having direct flights, Qantas, an Australian airline, and Qantas, and in fact, it was a direct flights and also calling it Taipei and Taiwan and not Republic of China. And Qantas rolled over and just did what they said. Okay, what would you like us to call it? Why was that? Because the trade with China is so important to us. So to that extent, because we are so vulnerable to those Chinese trade agreements, which are crucial to our economy, we do play softly. We don't play favourites in the South China Sea. Every now and again, one of our planes will fly over one of their newly created atolls on which they're putting some warships, but we'll let the battle between the United States and China play out at that level. We're going to have both of them as our friends. We're not going to play one off against the other. That's kind of a general idea.
Is it fair to say you're trying to walk a fine line?
We're walking a fine line, and we're also giving a lot of money to South Pacific nations, but not in any way as a defiance of China, but just as a way of saying we can be your friend as well. So we're buying some influence there. The other question is about the living wage. The quick anecdote was when I and my family were living in Iowa, we had a baby and we needed a childminder for the first time, and I can still recall the childminder came in from college, and she was there for the 3 hours. We went to the cinema and came back, and I think I gave her a $20 note. Now, this is going back 20 years. And she looked at me as if, do I need change? And I said, well, you're a student, you've got a lot of concerns, this is your income, you looked after our baby, you were fantastic, the baby's still asleep, you changed its diaper once, that was fantastic, this is what you deserve. I got back to the department the following morning and the word was out that I was breaking the rules. This was far too much to give a student. I was actually now upping the ante, that now they'd have to match me, or else no one would do any work except for me. I'm not quite sure where that was going, but it suddenly occurred to me that American wages were terrible. And we now have a wage policy of high wages, highly unionised wages, collective bargaining, which has insisted that people need to have a livable wage. Now, this next election coming up, we'll have another union campaign with the Labor Party. The Labor Party is likely to win the election, which means the so-called livable wage, that's the term they're using now, will become party policy, and there'll be some wage claims, and I dare say there'll be some wage rises, the result of which the economic adjustments will need to be made. But the fact is, it hasn't crucified our economics, and after all, we haven't been in a recession for the last 20 or 30 years. So there's nothing wrong with a high livable wage. We are also highly taxed. Not as highly taxed as the Scandinavians. I lived in Scandinavia. The Scandinavians are the happiest people in the world. They're also the most highly taxed people in the world. You can be happy, have a good economic foundation, have a high livable wage and high taxation. Anyone who tells you otherwise in this country is wrong. There's a big call.
Other questions?
Okay, I see a hand over here, but I'll take a younger hand first, then an older hand.
My hand's already been answered.
Oh, okay. A younger hand here.
So I'm going to be the person that inquires about the gun control. That is an argument that a lot of left-leaning people will say, like, well, Australia does it and it goes well, and I'm really glad that that is succeeding in your guys' country. But then you have the arguments over here where it's like, well, if you take away people's guns, you're only hurting the middlemen. And so I just wanted to know why you think it's succeeding so well in Australia, and if there's a way that we can not model it, but gain some insights from you guys and maybe put that into policy.
I have been on record to say that I've been around this country now for 40 years. I don't think you'll ever have gun control. You've got the Second Amendment. It's got a bit of twisted English in it, but if you leave the comma out, it sort of half makes sense. I don't think, you know what I'm talking about, those of you who studied constitutional law, I don't think that when that section was written, they had any idea that AR-17s would be in common hands. These are the muskets. In fact, you might have seen that little YouTube where the guy gets into an argument, he takes out his musket and he pours some powder and he starts going like this. And he's sort of waiting for his antagonist to sort of sit there quietly while he prepares the gun and then checks it and then oils it and then pokes it down again and then he goes to fire it. And by the time he gets to fire it, he says, let's forget our differences anyway. I mean, that's the whole point. If you don't have the weapon, it's less likely that will have a fatal outcome. And it's not just me saying this. The women's rights movements are saying so many fatal outcomes happen because in arguments, to actually pick up a weapon and shoot someone is a lot easier than grappling with them or stabbing with them or doing something like that. You can do that at a distance. Look, I'm a gun control advocate, but I think this country has passed the point of no return. There have been some gun amnesties attempted in this country. They failed. We had a gun amnesty that people said, yep, we can do that. And I think the horror of Port Arthur was the linchpin to that. The horror of Christchurch made people in New Zealand say, that's not part of what we want. And my view would be, if you can have 20 elementary preschool kids being shot in Sandy Hook and not make a change to a public attitude, then nothing will ever change here. If you can't shoot, one person can't shoot 20 innocent little kids and not have one thing change under Obama, then I'm not making any judgment about that. I'm just saying the American people will just have to live with the consequences for all of your lives. There won't be gun control here, I can tell you that now.
Rick, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that said it's easier to do the kind of gun control you're talking about in New Zealand and Australia because of the low populations. 4 million in New Zealand, 25 million in Australia, whereas 330 million is more difficult, particularly with the history that we have.
That's true, and the frontier mentality. And there's also, and I say this with some knowledge, having lived in the United States, I've been in and out of the United States for 40 years, probably over time, probably 4 years, I would have thought I've been living here or in Canada. So I get the feeling of that. And the feeling that I get here, which is rather unnerving, is a lot of people say, well, we don't trust governments. And if governments want to take away our guns, what if the government comes for us for a whole range of other reasons? We can't defend ourselves. And coming out of the Australian, British tradition, we trust our governments. And if the government says, we don't want you to have guns, we say, okay. The Scandinavians say, if the government says you go to bed at 10 o'clock at night and don't spank your kids, that's what you do. That's just the way in which people are. We trust our governments to make decisions for us. There's a massive mistrust here of governments, and that worries me because a lot of people will say, well, I want to hang on to my gun because if all else fails and the government lets us down, I've got this to defend myself. I would have thought you'd want to have your congressman or congresswoman defend you, not something that you've got behind the door that someone's going to pick up, a friend, a relative, get in an argument and shoot your kids.
Other question.
Let's have, got any men? Men, I want a male question as well, but I see someone here and then one back over here.
So I guess addressing the compulsory voting and like preference voting, I think that I think it actually, like the way you describe it, it does sound really beautiful. That like everyone comes and they like raise money for the schools and they're cooking and it's just wonderful. But like knowing humanity, like there's probably a lot of people who shouldn't be walking in, like who walk into the voting places and have no idea.
It's a common thought. You vote?
Yeah. So like I understand why we don't make it compulsory in that way of like why would we actually want people to walk in there with no knowledge whatsoever of what they're doing and like that actually matters. So how do you kind of talk like how do
typically
you address that?
People who fall into that category will probably not cast a valid. You just have to turn up. You don't actually cast a ballot. They might want to say, or they write something on there a bit rude, or just do something stupid. They don't have to vote. They just have to turn up and have their name crossed off, and then they pass their ballot in. In fact, you don't even have to pass the ballot in. You can just pick it up, screw it up, throw it in the bin, and walk out, so long as your name has been cast off. My own view is that would be a very, very small minority. Most people have a view on what will affect their lives. Most people will have been exposed to the advertisements and the stuff that comes through the mail, or have had a visit in their school, or got a concern about the hospitals, healthcare, ageing, roads, rates, taxes. Most people have a view on that. And it may not be a totally informed view, but show me anyone who's totally informed on everything. So I trust people in that regard. There's a lot of people, I think, every now and again, I wish they didn't vote, but I need to have them have the right to vote. And in some respects, the way in which I focus on it is to say that I'm asking people to actually take some civic responsibility. At some point every 3 years, they have to spend some amount of time in a civic responsibility and give some thought to things outside their own entirely personal sphere of activity. And asking them to do that for a very short period of time, every 3 years, is not that much.
One of the things that my wife and I found fascinating in the last election was there was a quiet period right before the vote. There was a couple, 2 days or 3 days where there were no ads whatsoever before the vote. How does that work?
It's funny because it's kind of redundant now because of social media. You can't shut down social media. But it was a tradition that no television or radio advertisements would be allowed in the 48 hours prior to the vote. Why was that? It stopped people from the morning of the vote or the night before saying something outlandish do you know that the person standing for this particular party is a convicted pedophile? And the idea was, if that allegation was made, the person was in no position whatsoever to defend themselves. That was the reason. So it still exists, but it really doesn't matter because you've got so much media. The nice thing about social media is that if a person does make the allegation ahead of the poll, that allegation can be easily refuted by someone saying, well, thank you very much for that. It's not true. So to that extent, that's been overcome. But we still have the rule. You can't have a television advertisement 48 hours prior to the poll. Yeah. I saw a hand back here. I see a microphone right coming towards you. There we go.
Okay, so down in Sydney, you guys have like one of the biggest Christian worship like groups. Does that affect like the spread of Christianity throughout Australia, or even like the politics in each of the different states?
Look, that's a terrific question about the Christianisation or the religionisation of Australia. Every 3 years, 4 years, we have a census. I'm sure you have census, whatever the plural of census is, censi. You have a census here. And the last 2 censuses have asked questions about religious adherence and religious faith. The last 2 have included a question of no religion. And from memory, it was something like 20% 3 or 4 years ago. The poll that was taken 18 months ago had 30% of Australians now have no religion. 50% of Australians declare Christianity as their religion, half of whom are Catholic, and the other half are everything else in between. Muslims are about 2% of the population, Buddhists about 3% of the population, and I think Hindu about 1% of the population. They're the 3 main Asian and Middle Eastern adherents. That's the people who are prepared to check that particular box on the census. On any Sunday, you might find only about 1% of Australians actually physically going to church. Is that a good or a bad thing? I think that one can say that Australia has reached a consensus that religion is badly organised, but that a faith and a spirituality on an individual basis is a good thing. So most people are prepared to say, I'm happy to say that I'm a Christian, but I don't want to go to church. And that's a challenge for the Christian churches to say, right, we've got people out there that want another dimension to their life, that actually have a spiritual edge, that feel the comfort at a time of grieving, comfort at a time of a new birth. Christmas and Easter come around and the churches are filled for those 2 days. They're called C of E. You've probably heard the expression, Christmas and Easter, C and E's. And so people are quite happy to say that can be part of their community, but they're not prepared to go down the path, particularly with the Catholic Church and other churches, of course, and all of the recent revelations about the child abuse and everything else that's been going on for the last 30 or 40 years that we now know about. So religion's taking a battering, and it's up to religious leaders, I think, to say, well, religion is all about community, it's all about giving, it's all about outreach, and as the minister said this morning, it's all about loving your neighbour as yourself. Now, that shouldn't be simply, and we know, because it comes out of the scriptures, and the scriptures that we share with Islam and share with Judaism, those early 5 books of the Bible, comes out of that very strong tradition of hospitality. And forgive me again for saying I was in Iran last May at a couple of academic conferences talking about the rule of law, which was interesting because my American visa was taken away. But that's another story. The irony of having my American visa taken away by going to Iran, could talk about I had to get another visa, but that was kind of me had to declare my faith in the rule of law, presumably, is that the massive tradition of hospitality to the stranger is played out every day in Iran, for example. Now, their politics in relation to the mullahs, the autocratic way in which their theocracy works, their nuclear program worries me intensely, but on the street, they are wonderful people.
Speaking of Iran.
Can't hear.
Let's try it again. Speaking of Iran, sorry. Tell us about your insights of being there, your view of the young people and what you think might happen in the next generation.
Well, I was astonished. I was there. Of course, this is just anecdotal. This is me being there 2 weeks, and obviously I can't speak more broadly than that. But the 2 weeks that I was there, I gave all my lectures in English. I couldn't believe the student population, all aged your age, are speaking good English. That just astonished me for a start. The fact that they were all highly respectful and knowledgeable of world affairs, and the ones I spoke to in confidence who said to me that they thought their theocracy would be gone within a generation and a half, because you can't have the knowledge that's coming through in social media. You can't get Facebook there, but you can get WhatsApp. And they can't get certain websites, but they can get other international websites, and they're recognizing that Western values are values that they'd like to emulate. And they can mix those Western values with their Asianization or their Middle Easternization in fact, going back to China, as you know, there's the Belt and Road policy now, where China, in fact, wants to unite China through Iran on the old Silk Road into Europe. So the way in which Iran will have to be part of that, world global economy. You can't be isolationist. And here's me making a pledge that the leaders of this country should realize. The more you alienate, yes, you're putting pressure on them in relation to their nuclear program, and yes, we can worry about that. And yes, we can worry about their support for Hezbollah and what's that doing to Israel, etc. But you can do that in a way that doesn't isolate them. Every time they're isolated economically, all the people on the streets are hearing is the United States is destroying our economy. It seems to worry me that the United States foreign policy in relation to Iran should in fact be embracing Iran to say, look, we can actually do this softly. We can actually talk about your nuclear program, keep it's already gone now, keep the Obama contract intact, and work on a way of making sure that Iran comes into the 21st century as a country that can embrace Western values rather than isolate it. And that's what people were saying to me. We think the mullahs will be gone in a generation and a half, but no one's going to replace them with the American West, because we don't trust you guys, because all you're doing is destroying us economically. It's a strange conundrum.
Rick, as an Australian, you're able to get into places that many Americans can't because of that Australian accent and the Australian background. They more than welcome you than they would if it was somebody who was an American. Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, there were Americans at this conference, and they were quite happy to talk on these matters with students. But yes, I worry that any foreign policy that alienates is not going to be a policy when things suddenly vacate. And we know that the American policy in relation to Iraq, we didn't have Saddam Hussein with weapons of mass destruction, and essentially, perhaps oversimplified, essentially gave rise to ISIS because a vacuum was there that the Americans couldn't fill. Having got rid of one dictator, it let a vacuum to enable another. It's a very strange organisation to emerge. A strange organisation, which I should say had been placed, in isolation by Saddam Hussein for all of his wrongs. At the very least, he was keeping a lid on ISIS and their ilk. So I'm not going to be a critic of American foreign policy, but I think, and that's the funny thing about American foreign policy, you've got some of the best foreign policy think tanks in the world. Somehow or other, they don't seem to be feeding back into the White House. I'm not sure what's going on.
Other questions?
What about from a male? We've had lots of female questions. There's a challenge. There's one. Wait for the microphone.
To start off, thank you so much for your time and bringing your views and the perspective of a different culture into the campus and allowing us to kind of be expanded by the challenge to think beyond what we consider to be normal. On that note, I'd like to address the economic mobility in Australia, as well as the disappearance of the middle class, and how there is very little hope to see a change happen from those immigrating into the upper elite. And then also, what are your thoughts on America as a melting pot and having the gun control issues be viewed as that point, whereas there's countless different views and opinions all being brought in at the same time, a constant battle for power and for primal narrative. How would you recommend America moving forward best enable its people to rise in their social strata with their ideals without the tendency for violence, because it seems inevitable?
Okay, two questions. The melting pot one I'll come to in a minute. The first question is this question or this issue, which is not only rife in Australia, but in this country and other countries as well, where there seems to be a growing disparity between rich and poor. We've seen the figures, not just in our countries, but the OECD. The sad thing about that is if you have people like Bernie Sanders and others, and we have our Labor politicians in Australia saying the same thing, anyone who suggests that's not a good thing by having a livable wage and having a greater tax on the wealthy, in fact, the Labor policy is to remove 2 tax exemptions at the moment for wealthy Australians with an idea of trying to reduce this growing disparity between rich and poor. You're talking about the disappearance of the middle class. I think that's an overstatement, but there's certainly a growing disparity between rich and poor. I think Australia will vote Labor in this election in May, which will be, in a sense, to give the check and the go-ahead for the getting rid of the tax exemptions for the ultra-rich, which will probably have some effect on trying to reduce that, by also making sure there's a livable wage and enacting legislation to ensure that occurs for all employers. So that is being addressed. But you're quite right, it actually is a dilemma for countries who are attempting to have some sort of more even spread of income. The sad thing in this country and mine is as soon as you talk about that as being a social policy, someone who doesn't like the idea of someone getting a benefit that they didn't get, or for some other reason, they call it socialist. You mention the word socialist, people run a million miles and vote against you. Now, Bernie Sanders has come out and he now calls it democratic socialism. And that's probably a better way of describing it, but for somehow or other socialism has become a dirty word, even though it appears to be the word that is trying to make sure that this massive disparity between the ultra-rich and the people who are still sleeping on the streets and the homeless can somewhere or other be bridged. Now that just leads as a segue to the idea of the melting pot. And I think the nice thing about America, it has been a massive melting pot. That's the great achievement of America in the last 250 years, that it's become the great melting pot. The beauty of that is it has ideas from people who say we can do things differently. We shouldn't have 4 or 5 elite families, whether they're the Gettys or the Rockefellers, making all our decisions on the basis of all the money they made back in the 19th century in oil reserves. There's got to be a better way. The other nice thing about America, and I should say some nice things about America tonight, is the philanthropic tradition is absolutely to die for. Now that has been to a large degree through taxation, but don't worry, Americans are probably the most generous people in the world in that regard. So Australia is trying to emulate its philanthropic endeavours as well. But I think America is a leading light to the world. The fact of the matter is you do have millions of people every year who want to come to this country for whatever reason, particularly to make good economically. And to the extent that they add to the cut and thrust of the debate is a very good thing. I would like to see America embrace, as Canada has done, a second language. I think America could do a lot more with the Spanish language and actually say this is now a national language. In the same way that I'd like to see Australia say that one of the Asian languages could quite easily become a national language. Chinese could become a national language, not within my lifetime, but within my kids' lifetime. It is a global economy, it is a global world. We have to see ourselves in that regard.
By the way, you had a Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who was fluent in Chinese.
Yeah. He had been a Chinese Australian diplomat in China, which was interesting because this was the time when Chinese human rights record, well, there's never been a time when Chinese human rights record hasn't been bad, but he was lecturing the Chinese in Chinese on their human rights record. That didn't go down so well. And in some respects, I think they thought that he was being a little too big for himself. When you lecture, you don't lecture the Chinese. You do a little softly approach and hope that at some point there will be an uprising, hopefully not a bloody one, but something that brings the Chinese into the 21st century, which has a few more democratic values than they're exposing at the moment. China is a worry, there's no question about that, but dealing with that particular part of the world has to be done very carefully. How's our time going, Kyle?
We're going to close here in a minute. I want to also thank Rick for being here. One of the great things about Centennial Institute and certainly the College of Undergraduate Studies is we encourage opinions that are not necessarily what we hold, perhaps, in here at this institution. And so we'll have professors that will be dealing with this tomorrow, I'm sure. Some of your comments in that regard, Rick. But we do appreciate your being here. We thank you so much for providing us with some new insight. So please, join me in a round of applause.
Now, it's a bit like compulsory voting. I think you had to be here tonight, but see how much you enjoyed it? Yeah, just think of those sausage sizzles next time. Yeah, sorry.
Rick, will you be here for a few minutes in case
I'll be here
people
for a
wanna
few
go?
minutes. If anyone wants to talk about coming to Australia on an exchange, we have programs.
Thank you again for coming. Appreciate it.